Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Thursday lunchtime lecture from us here at the Church's Conservation Trust. It's really great to be talking to you all today. I hope you've had a good week wherever you are joining us from. It's quite grey and windy here in London today, but for those of you who've been joining us for the last couple of weeks, you'll be very pleased to know that I'm back home and Clement is behind me. So it's really great to be joining you today. Now, our Chief Executive, Peter Ayres, isn't with us today. He's on annual leave. So it falls to me to do Church of the Week. So bear with me a second while I just share my screen and I'll get the PowerPoint going. And we'll start Church of the Week. So firstly, as is always the case with our lectures, I'd like to say thank you to Ecclesiastical for kindly sponsoring these Church of the Week and for their support of our lunchtime lectures. Today's church is a favourite among our supporters, and it's one that I've had the pleasure of visiting, and I visited it on the Great National Steeplechase a couple of years ago when we popped down to Bristol, and it is the Church of St Thomas the Martyr in Bristol, and this is dedicated to St Thomas a Becket. It's not Thomas the Disciple, this is Thomas a Becket's church, but you'll find out a little bit more about the dedication shortly. It's situated in a busy commercial area of central Bristol, and it's a fine example of classical design. The elegant interior is 18th century. It's got really impressive furnishings, and the tower, though, that you can see on the exterior here is 15th century. And this survives from an earlier church which was on the site. Now, I'm just going to move on. There we go. So the first church on the site was founded at the end of the 12th century during a prosperous period in Bristol's history, when the town expanded south of the River Avon and new churches were built to serve the rapidly growing population. The whole district was part of the large parish of Bedminster, and the two churches, St Thomas and St Mary Redcliffe, remained as chapelries of Bedminster throughout the Middle Ages. So for those of you who know Bristol, St Mary Redcliffe is probably its most iconic and famous church. I think it was Queen Elizabeth I who said that this is England's most noblest of parish churches, but these both St Thomas the Martyr and St Mary Redcliffe were the premier churches of Bristol. But as I said, this area around the church was occupied by weavers, fullers, dyers, smiths, tanners and carpenters, as well as several wealthy merchant families whose ships lay in the nearby River Avon. The church was originally dedicated to St Thomas of Canterbury, whose cult became popular after his murder in 1170. However, after the Reformation, Henry VIII forbade the veneration of Thomas a Becket, and a dedication was changed to St Thomas the Apostle. So there are a lot of churches across England were dedicated to Thomas a Becket. Those dedications a lot of them were all changed at the Reformation. And it's quite interesting because obviously Thomas Becket was famous for rebuking a king, standing in opposition. So you can understand why Henry VIII, going against the Pope, going against the church, why he would have issues with Thomas Becket. But just so you can see, in the middle of the map is where St Thomas is, and you can see the old bridge there. You can also see Temple Church, which was bombed in the Second World War, and you can see another church at the top. But you'll see on this slide here, I'm sorry it's a bit blurry, this image, but it's the only one I could find. But since several wealthy and pious merchant families, including the Canyages, resided in the area, both St Thomas's and St Mary Redcliffe received numerous endowments. This enabled both churches to be rebuilt and furnished with in the grander style during the later Middle Ages. St Thomas's church was on a restricted site, so couldn't be enlarged to the same scale as its counterpart St Mary Redcliffe was. However, by the end of the 15th century, the original Norman church had been transformed into a spacious and beautifully decorated building. We know that because there's a lot of medieval wills which survive from St Thomas, Bristol, and we know what was built. We even know some of the paint schemes at St Thomas's thanks to these wills. But it was during later on in the 1780s, before the current St Thomas's church was demolished, before the medieval church of St Thomas was demolished, it was said that it was only second to St Mary Redcliffe in terms of its architecture for being up and tile, but also the splendour of the furnishings and the liturgical tools inside the church. And you're going to see some really interesting treasures later on, which will show why this church is so special. Now, the area around the church remained crowded with houses, workshops, warehouses, and all the busy trade of the dockside. And this continued right up until into the 20th century. And you can see this picture here of Bristol in 1890. A lot of this was bombed, as I said, during the Second World War. Bristol, you hear a bit more about the impact of World War II on the church shortly. But it's really important to know that next to St. Thomas's is a really important medieval inn, and that's the Seven Stars Tavern. Now, many of the sailors who came to Bristol and who were engaged in the slave trade lodged at the inns and taverns in the parish of St. Thomas's and on St. Thomas's Street. And it was in 1786 at the Seven Stars Tavern, which exists next to the church today, that Thomas Clarkson collected much of the evidence about the barbarous trade, which eventually led to the abolition of the slave trade. So it's a really important piece of social history that that tavern is still there. But it's also important that we acknowledge the role that slavery had in the development of Bristol. So on to looking inside this church, because it really is beautiful. Now, in 1786, they were carrying out routine repairs to the church, and they discovered some very severe faults with the structure. And a report was written, and the churchwarden's parishioners duly noted the report, and it was decided to demolish the medieval church and rebuild it in a more modern style. So in February 1789, permission was given by James Allen to draw up plans for the church that you can see today. Now, we don't know much about James Allen. What we do know that he was an architect who trained under the Patty family, and he was involved in various building projects in Bristol and Clifton. Now, what's interesting, and I didn't learn this until I was doing research for Church of the Week, is that Allen went bankrupt along with several other Bristol architects during the rapid collapse in property price and values and building work following the outbreak of war against France in 1793. But as I said, his plans were approved in 1789. The first foundation stone for the new St. Thomas's was laid in in 1792, and by the 21st December 1793, the first service could be held inside the church. An Act of Parliament was passed so that the church could actually take out loans and mortgages to pay for this new church. And it wasn't up until 1825 that they finished repaying all those loans and mortgages. And we know that because we've still got records of the annual accounts of the church. So again, it's really interesting looking at the accounts. We can see what was built when and get a feel for how much the church has changed or how little it's changed in some cases. Now, the dignified interior of St. Thomas's has a large entrance lobby at the western end, which you can just see there under the gallery, which means the church in itself is 32 feet shorter than its medieval predecessor. Now, the arched windows, which you can just see on the left of the screen, bathe the interior with this incredible light. And because it's whitewashed inside, it's an incredibly light and airy church. Now, Allen retained many of the fine furnishings from the old church, and this is an example of one of the furnishings that wasn't chucked out with the old church. They brought it into the new one. And this, what you can see here, is made of Flemish oak and was purchased by the church in 1716 at the cost of then of £170. It was made by William Killigrew of Bristol, who was a joiner. Now, this is the best and most elaborate reredos that survives in Bristol. The carving of classical columns, the 7 candlesticks, the pediment with a pelican and piety, and the carved decorations of wheat, grapes, and flowers are of incredibly high quality. Now, the pelican is in the middle, under that triangular on top of the columns. You can just see the pelican feeding there, and that's symbol for Christ feeding his children with his own blood. But it's beautiful. Now, what you can see paintings in some of the niches. You've got the 4 paintings there. Originally, it wouldn't have had paintings. You would have had the law, the creed, the Lord's Prayer, and the 10 Commandments. But these paintings put in 1907, and they depict biblical scenes. So we've got the obviously the Sermon on the Mount. We've got the Last Supper at the very top there. We've got the Prodigal Son and the Good Samaritan. The windows are very worthwhile taking a moment to come and look in the church, because it creates, on a really sunny day, you get these spectacular effects of light thanks to the geometric patterns there. If this was very deeply rich coloured stained glass, it'd be a much darker church. So I'm quite pleased that you've got these lovely light, simple windows. Now on the right is something else that survived from the earlier church, and this is dated to 1637, and these are the royal coat of arms of King Charles I. So again, it's a rare survival. Now, I said there were some treasures at this church, so I'm going to try and whiz through and talk to you about just 2 treasures at this church. Now, at the Trust, we not only own church buildings, but we also care and are responsible for many priceless artifacts and treasures. And this church has a couple I want to talk to you about. Now, in around 1410, a new Bible was made for this church. The Bible was handwritten on vellum and contained the Old and New Testaments. It followed the Vulgate, which is a Latin version of the Bible translated by St. Jerome in the 4th century. To the present day, this Bible is highly significant internationally, because it's not only as it survives, it is one of only 3 complete English medieval Vulgate Bibles in the country. One of them is at Winchester College, and the other one is at the British Library, and the other one is in Bristol. So it's an incredibly important survivor. Now, it suffered considerable damage during the Second World War. Bristol was the 5th most heavily bombed British city, and it was deposited in the Record Office of Bristol for safekeeping in 1950 by St. Thomas the Martyr Church. The church came into our care in 1988, so when the damage occurred, it wasn't in our care. It was rediscovered, however, just after the end of the Second World War at the bottom of the tower. Now, the base of the tower was flooded as it sits below the water level, and the Bible was wrapped up and sitting in pools of water. And as a result, it did become incredibly damaged, and it's very, very fragile to handle. However, there is a good news story here. So a few years ago at the Church Conservation Trust, we did some fundraising to have some conservation work carried out. And we teamed up with the St. Thomas Ecclesiastical Charity to fund this conservation work. And I'm really pleased to say it was a huge success. I'm going to show you some of the results. So here you can see some of the conservation work taken out on just this one page. The Bible, as I said, is incredibly fragile, and as such, is not available for the public to view. It's now safely stored in the Bristol Record Office. As I said, though, because it's so fragile, you can't see it, I'm afraid. But as part of the works, we had a digital record made of it, so you can access digital records of the Bible. Sorry, excuse me, everyone. I've got a bit of a cold that I'm just trying to battle off at the moment. So, but I hope you've been impressed with that treasure. Now, time for one last treasure. I'm going to try and quickly whiz through this. Now, the church also boasts 4 13th century Limoges candlesticks. They were made in Limoges, an inland town in western France, and it is highly likely that they were brought to Bristol through the port's trade links with Bordeaux and Bayonne in Gascony. They have copper bases and were originally gilt. The gilt is richly inlaid with enamel and decorated in bright colours, but they are not made of any precious metal. To visitors of St. Thomas's, they would have been a clear sign of the parish's wealth and intense pious giving of the parishioners. They would have signalled that the parish or one of the parishioners had the purchasing power to buy an object from the continent. Now, these 4 candlesticks are thought to be the oldest set of candlesticks in the United Kingdom. Today, to allow more people to access and view these candlesticks, and also for their protection, we've loaned them to the Bristol City Museum, where you can go and view them. Now, I'm just going to stop my screen share there. I hope everyone, that was interesting. Church of the Week. So that was the Church of St. Thomas the Martyr in Bristol. Now, as I said, our Chief Executive, Peter Rose, is away on holiday, so we're not going to do any questions this week. But for those of you joining us for the first time, we're very shortly going to be starting the lecture, but thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Do comment away and let me know where you're watching from. Now, as always, these lectures are free of charge. So if you are liking them, please do hit that like button, subscribe and follow us on social media, and do share these films with your friends and family. They are always recorded, so this is being recorded at the moment, and you can catch up on any of our lectures completely free of charge. on either Facebook or on YouTube. Now, if you are enjoying these, I know a lot of people have become members with us already, but if you'd like to become a member of the Trust and show your support and have a deeper relationship with us and help us in conserving our collection of 356 historic churches, you can do that in a couple of ways. You can text donate, so you can give a gift by texting CCT to 70331, and that will give us a gift of £3. Alternatively, you can donate any amount you wish through our website, which is visitchurch.org.uk, or you can join us as a member, and you'll get a free copy of this, which is The Secret Language of Churches and Cathedrals, which was written by a previous lunchtime lecturer of ours, Dr. Richard Stem. And this is a phenomenal book. I say it every week, but I love it. It's got fantastic imagery right throughout. It charts everything to do with parish churches, with cathedrals, and it's a great companion to this lecture series. But if you join us by direct debit and use the offer code lecture, you'll get a free copy of this. But in addition to that, you'll get access to our exclusive member lectures that we've started. You also get regular updates from us at the Trust, a members magazine, and we'll be making an announcement in a couple of weeks because there's a new benefit that's going to be launching towards the end of September for members that I think a lot of you are going to be very, very excited about. Now, there's just one final thing that I need to mention to everyone. Now, on Saturday, the 11th of September, across the country, it's a national event called Ride and Stride. And this is when, across the country, local historic church trusts, different counties, put on a sponsored bike ride to raise money to help care for and support conservation work and repairs at historic churches in various counties across the country. Now, for the first time, the Churches Conservation Trust are going to be entering a team this year. And it's a team of 2 people, and I'm one of them. So it's going to be myself and my manager, Shana James. We're going to be cycling around my hometown of Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, and we're partnering with the Suffolk Historic Churches Trust. And we're going to be cycling 39 miles in one day, and we're visiting 21 churches. Now, I'll post a link to the route so you can see the route we're going to be doing, but we're looking for sponsorship. So if you would like to sponsor us, please do follow the link, and please be as generous as you feel able to. But I should say that one of the great things about this is that 50% of the money is going to be going to a dedicated, specifically to a CCT church on the route. So there are 3 CCT churches on that route. Half the money goes to one of those CCT churches. The other half goes to the Suffolk Historic Churches Trust, who then distribute the money via grants and other schemes to active parish churches which are still used for regular worship in the county of Suffolk. We'll be posting more about this over the coming week, but if you've got any questions, everyone, let me know. Now, without any further delay, let me pass you over to today's guest lecturer, Dr. Christina Welch, who is from the University of Winchester. Now, Christina, I know very well because you used to be my professor, you used to teach me, and I did it a few years ago, the MA in Deaf Religion and Culture with Tina. And it's really great that Tina's come back to do another lecture for us. I think it's going to be really interesting learning about some of Tina's cutting edge research that she's been doing over at St. Vincent. Now, if you've got any questions for Tina, please use that comment box and we'll put your questions to Christina at the end of the lecture. But over to you, Tina.
Thank you very much, George. Let me just share my screen. And, oh, where are we? I can never remember which one this is. Isn't that bad?
View. I think it's on
screen share. There we go. Pay from start. Had to wait for that to go. So sorry about that. A bit of technological incompetency. As always, thank you very much, George. Thank you for inviting me to do this. Something a little bit different because this is actually about a church in the Caribbean, although it links really nicely with what George was talking about with St. Thomas's, not just because obviously there's a history of enslavement here, but I noticed on one of the photographs, it was before one of the surviving screens, I think, that on the back wall, which I'm assuming was the west wall, but it was difficult to tell, there were some memorials, which you'll see very similar ones in St. Vincent. So this talks about the memorials in the Anglican Cathedral in St. Vincent in Kingstown, which is the capital, and the lives of some of those commemorated during the colonial era and beyond. It does get a little bit complicated because of names, and these names won't be familiar to you at all. but do bear with me. And it's a version of a talk that I actually gave in this cathedral in March 2020. I was there just before everything locked down. It was very bizarre coming back to this country, and everything literally shut down the day I arrived. And I was presenting there on their 200th anniversary. So it was a really special event. Now, I imagine it's a place that very few people know much about. So I want to start with a very general context. And I do mean very general. The history obviously is a lot more complicated than this, but in brief. So St. Vincent is a windward isle in the Caribbean. Not colonised immediately, in the 18th century, it had the status of being an independent Carib territory, home to a small French settler population with a modest population of Africans and also of Caribs. The Caribs comprised island Caribs, who were often called red or yellow Caribs and are now known as Kalinago. And there were black Caribs, who are now called Garifuna. The Garifuna are basically a group of people whose roots were in the intermixing of so-called runaway and shipwrecked enslaved African peoples from neighbouring islands with the indigenous island Caribs. It was only after the conclusion of the Second Carib War in 1797 that the British were able to consolidate control and by doing so establish a small sugar industry. The memorials inside the cathedral largely relate to colonial planters, many of whom used African enslaved labour and or members of the militia who fought in the two Carib Wars. As such, there are live issues relating to decolonisation, with some locals calling for the removal of the memorials. The current Anglican cathedral in Kingstown dates back 200 years, but as a place of worship and a place of burial, there's been this on the site for much longer. As such, the extant memorials in the cathedral grounds, so those are the ones that you can see, represent only a fraction of those interred within the boundaries of its walls. And as with the memorials inside the building itself, some only commemorate the life of an individual, not mark their final resting spot. Now, I spend a lot of time in graveyards as I research death as a cultural phenomenon. Now, everybody dies, but the rituals, myths, and memorials vary from culture to culture. And because social status and gender can affect the material culture of the dead, memorials are inherently political. And in St. Vincent, the colonial era memorials speak to the need of the emerging community to demonstrate their settledness. By remembering or burying their dead in particular parts of the island, they could display that the island was their home. So in this talk, I'll explore some of the grave symbolism that emphasise this need. But I'll also go beyond the symbolism of the historic stone documents to give a general overview of the memorials and graves, with the aim to show how spending time in a graveyard and with church memorials can help us understand the past, or at least the part of the past that we have access to. But just as a brief aside, it's probably worth mentioning that if any of you have heard of the musical Hamilton, about Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers of America, his father is buried in the graveyard of St. Vincent, of St. George's Cathedral in Kingstown on St. Vincent. There is no extant memorial today, but on this slide you can see a copy of the register of his death that's in the burial registers in St. Vincent. So here in this photograph of the cathedral graveyard, we can see a range of grave designs, but I want to focus on the metal railings that surround some plots. Not a current fashion, but they tell us that the plots are old. This design ensured space was marked. The territory of the deceased was set out as a public statement, making sure that the living's descendants' social status was enhanced. It showed that the family could afford the space and also afford the decorative metal frame that delineated the plot. But the history behind this style of grave marker belies the ornamental, social, political purpose you see here, and this is the history of anatomy and the need for corpses on which medical students learnt their trade. The anatomical deception of the human body has a long history, as does the practice of grave robbing. The first known case of so-called body snatching dates to 1319, when 4 medical students took a corpse from a graveyard to enable them to learn dissection skills. Prior to the study of human anatomy, animals were dissected, leading unsurprisingly to some very interesting surprises for surgeons. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the practice of grave robbing grew alongside the increase in anatomy courses. This was furthered by a decline in executions, a source of fresh cadavers for dissections, and the lack of any means of refrigeration to keep bodies usable for more than a few days. Grave robbing was a crime, but one condoned by many medical practitioners given the wider public good of knowing about the human body. Autopsies, for instance, could demonstrate deliberate poisoning over a natural death. And eventually, because of the knowledge of dissection of cadavers brought us, organs can be repaired or even transplanted. So the history of anatomy is an uncomfortable one. And of course, whilst few people were overly concerned about the post-mortem fate of an executed criminal, most people were concerned that the violation of a body buried in consecrated ground may mean that person missed out on a proper afterlife. It's only in some religious traditions, and even then only relatively recently, that resurrection has not required an intact body. To stop the so-called resurrectionists from taking the corpse of your loved one, there are a number of measures that could be taken. If you were poor, then your grave would just be a hole in the ground and an easy target. So either you hoped the local cemetery dog would be a deterrent, or somebody had to sit on your grave for 3 nights and 3 days. If you had money, though, a slab would buy you something that needed to be shifted in order to make the corpse far harder for it to be removed. But harder still would be some form of metal railings, which meant the body didn't just have to be lifted from the ground, but over the top of a fence. A fence such as those shown here would make body snatching very hard indeed. Over time, these railings lost their practical purpose, but they remained as a decorative feature and a territorial marker, as you see here. So this style of cemetery marker is a colonial importation of a status symbol, a sign that the family had money. And just in case you're interested, the amazing building that you can see at the back is actually the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Kingstown. This slide shows some more examples of these railings, but with different designs. The one in the foreground marks a single grave spot. The design is elaborate and as such costly. So this grave shows that someone with wealth was buried here. It's also located close to the church and thus in a more prestigious location than graves further outwards toward the cemetery wall. Sadly, without burial records, it's impossible to know who this individual is. And whilst there are some burial records from this era in St. Vincent, they don't actually say where the people are interred. But the finials themselves show a high level of craftsmanship that went into the memorial. Whoever commissioned this wanted to ensure that the social status of the deceased individual was noted. This grave echoes the metal railing designs, but is more recent and cast in concrete. This is the grave to Moses II Huss, who in 1911 departed this life aged 62 years and is, quote, asleep in Jesus, close quote. Clearly an expensive and elaborate memorial, it's unclear whether it was erected shortly after his death or in 1942, the date at the bottom of the upright stone. I would suggest the latter, and this isn't unusual as grave markers such as this are not cheap and may have had to have been saved up for. But having a grave marker is important. St. Vincent, like much of the Caribbean, is, I would argue, far, far more religious than the UK. Events there often start with a Christian prayer, and Sunday church attendances are still something that people dress up for. With an active volcano on the island, regular hurricanes and floods, people there are far more exposed to the vagaries of nature than us, and funerals are a big affair. This slab memorial marks the grave of Mary Ann Taylor and her only infant Gertrude. The memorial does not state how they died, but the wording includes Edward Taylor, noting that he mourned his losses as a husband and father. Given Gertrude died before Mary, we can only imagine her grief. But what is interesting here is that Edward's name is prominent. The memorial may be to his wife and child, but his name and status are clearly made out for all to see. Given each letter incised into the slab would cost, this grave marker not only is a public display of grief, but an early 19th century display of wealth and social status to the wider community. As with the Taylor Memorial, on this one is slightly later though, once more we see the father's name prominent. So these slabs, as well as speaking of social status, also give us an insight into gender issues of the time. As was normal during this period of history, in European and thus settler society, children were the property of their fathers. But from the wording, we can tell more about the island's community during this period, as Richard Arundel was a medical doctor. And as we shall see shortly, a number of other memorials in the graveyard give us information about the professions of people living and working on the island. Graveyards really are fantastic places to learn a lot about history. But before moving on to say more about the jobs that people had on the island in colonial times, I wish to remain with the death of the young. Here we see two grave markers for two children. They're badly worn, too badly worn to locate the names of the deceased, but their small size shows that they were infants. As previously mentioned, there would be numerous unmarked graves on this site, so it's likely that this are just two of many, many young children who lived out their short life on the island, of whom we know nothing. Very old records rarely noted the age of the deceased, but life on the island for settlers was hard and precarious, with diseases new to them, as well as a lifestyle very different of that from home. However, of course, it was far worse for the enslaved Africans, and whilst there are records of freed people of colour buried in the cathedral, it's rare to find a record of someone enslaved. Graveyards are important sites of historical knowledge, both in what can be seen and what is absent. There will be many unmarked graves in the cemetery, people too poor to be able to memorialise their loss publicly, and those without social status, such as the enslaved, who were probably never given a final resting spot in a consecrated graveyard. But for those who could afford it, the death of a loved one enabled the family to publicly mark their status in society, and for us today to learn more about the past than history books might tell us. These memorials are a case in point. They're to men with the same surname, Lermond, their Scottish ancestry clear from George's headstone. George was, as can be seen from my transcription of the memorial, a blacksmith, and it seems he had long been one when he died in 1810, aged 50. One wonders if it was he who made some of the metal railings I showed earlier. The headstones are traditionally British in design, and I have yet to establish whether these colonial era memorials would have been incised locally on imported stone or imported as we see them now. Robert's memorial, 1850, is of a different design to George's, which suggests a change in mortuary fashion, consistent with that was happening in mainland Britain. But I need to do more research to fully understand this graveyard. Here we see a definitely imported memorial and another of the imported designs, a broken column. This is one of the many traditional forms of memorial where understanding visual language is important. A good deal of the symbols on the memorials can be quite opaque in meaning, but here it's clear. A life cut short, signified by a broken column. The column relates to the fashion for classicism, which started in the 16th century, but found its heyday in the 18th and early 19th century, when Greek and Roman revivalism really began to phase out the love of Baroque cherubs, garlands of fruit and flowers on the memorials of the social elite. The symbolism of memorials features strongly in the ones inside the cathedral because they remain unweathered and were literally designed with visual language to the fore. But before heading inside and looking at some expensive and lavish memorials to the departed, I want to talk a little about some of the more recent grave designs and what they mean in the context of developing Vincentian mortuary tradition. Here we see two examples of an almost shield-like memorial. They have a clear Christian symbolism. Baptiste and Smith have a cross, and Stokes a Bible and an angel. What's very noticeable here is the sunrise-sunset dating on both, which is not unusual in the Caribbean. But it's clear that although these are similar looking memorials, they were incised by different people, and you can tell that because of the lettering of the N, which is reversed on one and not reversed on the other. We've seen the same sort of shield type memorial here with these painted white grave markers, although the dating is more traditional. This style seems to date from the late 1970s and stands in marked contrast to the earlier imported English memorials and more recent American style designs. This in the foreground is typical of the American style, and you can see some more vernacular ones behind. I make no judgments here, but as a scholar of death, the simple white markers stand out to me as a unique style to a Caribbean country that does things its own way. The incised granite memorials are almost ubiquitous now in Barbados, but seem to be less so in St. Vincent. That they exist, however, is a telltale sign of an increasing influence of American culture on the island. Although wandering around graveyards is an everyday activity for me and for many people in Britain, in the Caribbean, this is often seen as a somewhat, actually probably a pretty much very unusual activity. And as such, the study of memorials is largely the preserve of academics like me or foreign tourists. But as we can see in this shot, there are a number of grave marker designs, differences in size and shape and material, which can be very revealing. And it's such a shame that in places like the Caribbean, wandering around graveyards isn't more popular. Here we see some table tombs where the raised memorial does not contain a body, but it lies interred under the slab. What this style of memorial does, though, is through its elevation, make the plot more visible. Here, the height of the memorial literally signifies the higher social status of the individual, where money talks. These, of course, cost more than a slab that lies flat on the earth, and they also provide more space for words, or as we can see with this red stone one, displays a family crest. Here we see a mixture of old and new, the colonial era family burial area enclosed with metal railings and a more recent double grave decorated with domestic tiles. And here you can see just how much a graveyard can tell us about the passing of time. In this shot, we have traditional colonial era memorials, a Vincentian tiled grave and a recent American design. Like all things, graveyards reflect a community, the tastes of the time, and the social and gender status of individuals. Now, this memorial is typical of a very wealthy, high-status individual. It's large, atypical in design, and costly. It's clearly imported and displays the Grecian style of the memorial typical of the late 18th century. Perhaps, though, what's unusual is that this is a memorial only. There's no body here. Leyburn died in Grenada, and this memorial commemorates his social roles and his governorship of this and other islands. The inclusion of His Majesty's in the script emphasises the ceding of what were known as the Southern Caribbean islands to the British from the French. Today, St. Vincent and the Grenadines are one country, but as we can see from this script, in 1775, the Grenadine Islands were separate from St. Vincent, or St. Vincent's, as the memorial informs us. And if you look, it also just says Tobago, whereas now we talk about Trinidad and Tobago. So looking at these designs is really interesting. The wording will often tell us quite a lot about history that we may not know. As noted on his memorial urn, William Leybourne, or here just William Leybourne, died young at the age of 36 years of age. Despite being painted by one of England's most celebrated portrait painters, Thomas Gainsborough, little is known about his life. He, like Valentine Morris, who was the governor who succeeded him, however, refused to fund the Botanical Island on St. Vincent. So St. Vincent has a very well-known botanical garden. And indeed, he used the land that was given to grow medicinal plants to improve the overall life of the colony and keep the militia going, to graze his own cattle. Of course, those were imported livestock. Now, this course of action seems somewhat against the principles of humanity that the British authorities tasked the colonial governor with at the time. The Botanical Garden on St. Vincent was established in 1765 and is one of the oldest in the Western Hemisphere. And one of the notable superintendents, Dr. Alexander Anderson, who died in 1811, is buried somewhere in St. George's Cemetery. That Leybourne refused to support the development of medicinal plants makes his death from fever somewhat ironic, though, and I sort of kind of like that. The last of the memorials in the graveyard that this talk covers is that to Sir Charles Brisbane. He's buried outside the church beneath a table tomb with a fully inscribed memorial slab. Interestingly, the words incised on the outside memorial are identical to the memorial located inside the cathedral. Brisbane, therefore, is memorialised twice in the same location. The wording on his memorial is typical of the era, effectively all of the big achievements of his life displayed for all to see, and I will read it just in case You can't see that clearly. So it says, to the memorial of Sir Charles Brisbane, Rear Admiral of the Red Knight Commander of the most honourable military Order of the Bath, Governor, Captain General and Vice Admiral of the island of St Vincent and its dependencies. He was the fourth son of Admiral John Brisbane, descended from an ancient family long resident in Brisbane in the county of Ayr in northern Britain. Born in the year 1772, died in November 1829. Having early entered into the Royal Navy, he distinguished himself in various actions and in the year 1807 achieved the memorable capture of the island of Curaçao. As a reward for this distinguished conduct, he was appointed governor of this colony, which he retained for a period of upwards of 20 years. The inhabitants of this island, being desirous of recording their gratitude for this services, have caused this tomb to be erected in his memory. By inhabitants of this island, we can assume he only means settlers and not the remnants of the local indigenous population who escaped the British exile at the end of the Second Carib War, nor the enslaved Africans. You can see why this style of memorial is perceived as somewhat highly problematic today. The memorial inside the cathedral is, as you can see from these photographs, very grand and includes a depiction of his medal for capturing the island of Curaçao. As a piece of artwork, it is stunning. But Brisbane was governor of St Vincent from 1808 until his death in 1829. Although Britain outlawed the trade in slaves in 1807, slavery remained legal in the Caribbean until 1833, and as such, under Brisbane's governorship, enslaved Africans continued to labour for the financial benefits of their British masters. Indeed, Brisbane himself purchased 5 slaves in 1809. That Brisbane was a significant figure in British history is evident from the painting showing him conquering Curaçao and the set of stamps issued in 1969 that commemorate the bicentenary of his birth. These stamps were issued a decade before St Vincent became independent, and as such his status today may be a lot less celebrated than in bygone years. But as well as being commemorated twice in St Vincent, Brisbane also has a memorial tablet in England, with similar wording attesting to his military deeds and how much the colony lamented his loss. Although given he procured land from planters on the island in slightly obscure ways, I'm not entirely sure this sentiment is particularly accurate. This memorial was erected by his children in England and memorialises their mother as well as their father's career. This then was designed to glorify Brisbane and speak of his character as a man, beloved by his offspring, and of the piety of his wife. So memorials are really strange historical documents and can't be taken at face value. What follows next is a set of biographies about some of the people commemorated inside the cathedral, along with information about relative acquaintances, which I hope will be interesting in terms of the colonial history of a lesser known Anglo-Caribbean island. John Dalziel's memorial tells us he dies in 1829, aged 47, was Speaker in the House of Assembly and that he had a family. From various sources, I found out that in 1818, he was captain of the Southern Regiment, and by 1828, he was colonel, with his brother Robert replacing him as captain. His estates on the island included Cane Wood and Coombaimaru, which I might be pronouncing wrong, so if you're from St Vincent, huge apologies. Dalziel bought the latter estate in 1823 with 62 enslaved Africans. He sold it in 1825, so just 2 years later, to the Bale family with 171 enslaved Africans. So that's in 2 years, from 62 to 171 enslaved workers. And do remember at this time, slavery had been outlawed in England in 1807. So the buying and selling of slaves here is almost 20 years later. Now, the design of the memorial with its covered urn is fairly standard, as is sadly the wealth of the man who gained his wealth off the back of slave labour. Robert Poole is another planter who owned enslaved Africans. He too was a senior member of the island's council. Poole, together with a gentleman called Cole Turner, operated as the St Vincent and Tobago wings of the Glasgow trading company Alexander Houston and Co. Turner led the organisation's efforts in Tobago, with Poole remaining on St Vincent. Robert Poole's son, Charles, was educated in England, as was common for the time, and he became a vicar in Ireland. He married a woman called Frances Keegan. She was the third daughter of John Horne, and we'll talk about him in a minute. Frances and Charles Paul had a son called Charles Keegan Paul, who went on to found the publishing company Keegan Paul. Charles Keegan Paul, the grandson of the man commemorated here, published the letters of Mary Wollstonecraft, the philosopher and early advocate of women's rights, and of course, mother to Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. John Horne, his father-in-law, was married to a member of the Otley family, and the Hornes and Otleys owned several plantations on the island. Horne had connections with the East Indian Trading Company, and as such, Robert Paul and his circle stand as examples of the wide geographical links that estate owners on the island often had. And in terms of wide geographical links, in 1797, a 17-acre plot known as Lot 151 was sold to Messrs Walker and Atkinson. Together with additional land, this became Kingstown Park Estate, and in 1817 was owned by Paul. But the aforementioned Atkinson married a woman called Frances. After his death, Frances, then known as Fanny Atkinson, married William Greig. And whilst he died in 1795 during the Second Carib War, Fanny Gregg is buried at a church in Farlington near Portsmouth and has a village named after her on St Vincent. I've done a little bit of research into this, so that's another interesting story. Next, we move to John Rosh Dasent, who was president of the council, so another significant person in the island's colonial past. Together with Paul and Dalziel, he was well connected and a slave owner. North Union and South Union plantations were in his ownership in 1837 when slavery was abolished in the Caribbean. And he, like all other slave owners, were compensated for the loss of his slaves, which were, before emancipation, his personal property. The history of enslavement is one I can't delve into here in any depth because it's just too complicated. But it was central to the lives of many of those commemorated in this cathedral. And Dasent was one of those who was against emancipation, considering it ill-judged given the financial effect it would have on the economy of England and its colonies, and of course his own personal wealth. John Rosh Dasent is interesting in terms of family fortunes. He marries Harriet Frances Irwin, daughter of an heiress of Alexander Burroughs Irwin, who is also commemorated in the cathedral. And they have a son, John Berry Dasent. Now Harriet dies and John Rosh decides to marry Harriet's sister, Charlotte Martha. This move clearly shows the importance of keeping wealth in a family. Although if I'm being generous, it probably shows that he wanted to stay wealthy. Harriet's father disapproved of the marriage between John and Harriet, and in his will withheld £5,000 from her inheritance. He did, however, leave £8,000 to Charlotte, which is a little shy of £1 million in today's money if we factor in inflation. So on John Rosh Dasent's marriage to Charlotte, suddenly £8,000 would become his. Charlotte and John Rosh had several children: Burry Irwin, Alexander, Charles Underwood, and also George Webb. George Webb went on to become assistant editor of the Times newspaper in London and was also a writer. He wrote stories about Anansi, the West African trickster spider deity, and collected stories from enslaved Africans, most likely from those working on his father's estates. So the family profited in more ways than one from the slave trade. As you can see, Charlotte and John also had a daughter who died in infancy. She's buried within the cathedral close to the memorial. Now, what's interesting to me, though, is that the mason who commissioned the memorial to baby Charlotte is not the same mason employed to memorialise her father. However, Bacon was the mason employed to memorialise her grandfather, Alex Burroughs Irwin, and her mother's sister, Harriet. And this whole notion of the transatlantic slave trade, the transatlantic slave in memorials is something that I'm currently working on. And so to the aforementioned Burroughs. As you can see here, this impressive marble plaque by J. Bacon of London memorialises Alexander Burroughs Irwin, who died in 1806. his daughter Harriet Frances, and his son Henry Berry. The memorial names Alexander's wife Lydia, and interestingly, Lydia's first marriage produced somebody called Harry Hackshaw, who owned 2 plantation estates on the island. Unpicking the web of connections between the planters is proving tricky, to say the least, but it does seem that the social elite of the island was a close-knit community and keen to cement local bonds, with international connections to England, Scotland, the East Indies, and America. I would suggest that John Rosh may well have had a strong hand in commissioning the memorial to his father-in-law, his brother-in-law, and his first wife, and also the memorial to the infant Charlotte. That John Rosh's own memorial is manufactured by a different firm, Johnson of London, suggests to me a different commissioner. Alexander Burroughs Irwin had 2 sisters, Frances and Jane, and in his will of 1807, he left each of them and his wife an annuity of £100 a year. The equivalent today is a little over 11,000. And don't forget, he left Charlotte £8,000 and so died a very wealthy man, able to leave a considerable sum to his nearest and dearest. Alexander's fortune must have come in part from his father, Harry Alexander, who was an early plantation owner on the island. Harry purchased 3 lots in 1791, which collectively later became the Montrose estate. From the name, we can assume Scottish connections. So with father and son, much of the wealth was made off the backs of enslaved Africans. And as such, you can see why, although the Bishop of the Windward Islands wishes to keep these memorials in place, there are people who are calling for their removal. The memorial specifies that Alexander was a military man and that his final resting place was near the northwestern boundary wall of the churchyard. Given the burial was 215 years plus ago, it's unlikely it's going to be easy to trace, and one could assume, though, that it would have been an impressive grave. Daniel Mcdowell, as we can see, was also a military man. He served in the Southern Regiment of the island's militia and under the aforementioned William Greig. Mcdowell was a merchant in St Vincent and co-owner of Park Hill Estate and had business dealings with John Roche Dason. So you can see there's real connections between the plantation owners and on the island, which actually is quite a small island. On his death, he left a house in Kingstown and an annuity of £70 to his long-standing housekeeper, Anne, who is described in his will as, quote, a free mulatto woman, close quote. In today's money, Anne would be receiving just under £8,000, so this isn't an inconsiderable sum. And that the money was left specifically to Anne raises questions as to his relationship with her. The memorial to Mcdowell was commissioned by his daughter Anne, who less than 6 months after losing her father lost her husband, Peter Hill. They lived in Edinburgh in Scotland, where he worked as a collector of land taxes. There are other Mcdowells in the records, but it's unclear as to their relationship. But what is evident is that there are strong connections between Scotland and St Vincent, and possibly stronger than many other Anglo-Caribbean islands. The next memorial to explore is that of John Ordayne, and for this information I want to thank Dr. Kathleen Charter, who is currently writing a book on the Ordaynes. John Ordayne, like Daniel Mcdowell, was a merchant and estate owner. However, while it's unclear exactly what Daniel Mcdowell's relationship was with Anne, his housekeeper, John Ordayne married a black woman. Her name was Hannah Bannatyne, and she was his second wife. His first wife, Anna Marie Dalrymple, died young. Hannah and John had a number of children before locating to London. One of their daughters, Ida Augusta, became a concert harpist. Ida performed regularly from 1881 onwards, and Charter notes that all reviews about Ida agree she was a talented, graceful performer and became famous in her field. I've put up here an extract from the national biographies because it's not something that's necessarily easy to look through. So it just picks out some of the most important things here. But as you can see, as I've highlighted, Ada is one of the first known people of African ancestry to appear in the proms. So she really is a significant individual. Now, her skin colour was rarely commented on, and it's believed that her brother Harley, who inherited the Richmond estate, may well have helped financially support Ida through her musical career. This memorial to Morin speaks of great wealth. It's more elaborate than many I have mentioned, and as such, one would assume the Morins were wealthy plantation owners. However, it appears they were storekeepers, and the only record I can trace dates to a few years after the death of their clearly beloved daughter Janet. It concerns a London court case in which John and Samuel Morin won regarding the loss of a large amount of liquor, porter, stout, and ale, which was aboard the ship the Emerald when it was wrecked. Despite being alcohol merchants, the Morins were not as wealthy as many of their peers. In an 1826 list of subscriptions paid to, quote, the Society for the Conservation and Religious Instruction of the Negro Slaves, close quote, John Morin pays £2. Dayson pays £10 and Dalzell paid 20. These two men were far wealthier than the memorials in the cathedral. They were far the wealthiest. Their memorials in the cathedral are nowhere near as impressive as that towards Morin. So on looks alone, we could assume that the Morins were as wealthy and as prestigious even as Charles Brisbane. And so it's important not to make any assumptions when just exploring memorials, but to research further and find the stories behind the public face of a family. The final memorial I've chosen to highlight, as with many of those, speaks to the high death rate of the time. John and Charles Dayson lose their daughter as an infant, and Charlotte loses both her siblings and her father within 5 short years. I've already noted that Anne Hill's father and husband died within 6 months of each other. John Ordayne lost his first wife and any children she bore, and the Morins had just 9 months with their English-educated daughter before her life was cut short. But of all the memorials, that to the Kirbys is the saddest. Charles Kirby loses his 15-year-old daughter and 21-year-old son in September and October of 1833, and then his 14-year-old daughter the following year, just a few months after the death of his 16-year-old son, who had previously narrowly escaped a shipwreck off the coast of Barbados. The memorials inside St Vincent's Anglican Cathedral then stand as testimony to the sad realities of life for those who settled there. Yet it must be remembered that many, many more who resided in St Vincent during this period of history go unremembered. Too poor or too insignificant to warrant a grave marker in the cathedral grounds, or slaves whose bodies were buried goodness only knows where. Probably nowhere where a fee had to be paid, otherwise we'd have had documentation for that. So I end here by suggesting that the dead should not be forgotten, and that by engaging with memorials and the stories they tell, we can learn much about history, with the gaps in who was not memorialised speaking as loudly as those who were. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Tina, for that lecture. That was fascinating. And there's been some really interesting comments coming in. Everyone, we're going to be going into question time very, very shortly. But everyone, if you've enjoyed this lecture, please do make sure that you like and follow us on social media, but do also have a look at our upcoming lectures. There's a few coming up in October that I know you're going to particularly like. But next week we are joined by Dr. Alex Woodcock, who's going to talk to us about gargoyles and grotesques. Why are there monsters in churches? So do join us for that lecture. But if you've enjoyed these lectures, please do consider making a donation to help us care for our growing collection of historic churches across England. You can do that in a couple of ways. As I said, you can donate through our website, which is visitchurches.org.uk. You can send a text donation. So if you text CCT to 70331, that will give us a gift of £3. But also, if you become a member by direct debit, so direct debit starts with just £3.50 a month. If you use the offer code lecture, you'll get a free copy of this book, as well as our other amazing benefits. And as I said, we'll be making an announcement about a new benefit coming towards to members shortly. Now, Tina, I'm going to jump straight in with some questions. Is that okay? So the first question I'm going to jump in with is that obviously you've been looking at the Anglican Cathedral today on St Vincent. You showed that really stunning picture of the Roman Catholic Cathedral. Is there a difference in approach to memorialisation between the two cathedrals, and did they share the same cemetery?
No, they didn't share the same cemetery. And actually, I haven't had a chance to look at the Roman Catholic Cathedral, largely because it's also a school. And so whilst on my various visits, it's being used, there's actually children running around and stuff. So whereas I can actually spend some time exploring the graveyard in the Anglican Cathedral, I'm not disturbing anybody. But actually with the Roman Catholic one, I would be. And I've obviously got to be very mindful of education of young students. So unfortunately, I can't answer that, but there is a really good reason why I haven't gone and explored the Roman Catholic memorials. So yeah, sorry about that. But maybe at one time when I manage to go back, once I can travel again, I'll get a chance to have a look. But it does mean that I need to get to an empty cathedral.
Thanks, Dean. And similarly linked to that is it difficult to remain objective dealing with some of the issues that you've raised here, e.g. With regards to slavery?
I would say I'm not objective at all, actually. I mean, I'm objective in that I do think the memorials need to stay. I think taking them down would damage the memorials, and I think that would be problematic. I think you can learn a lot from these memorials. And whilst they're difficult to engage with, and, you know, I completely understand they're difficult to engage with, I actually think taking them down might not necessarily be the right thing to do, but it's not for me to decide that. If they are taken down, then they certainly shouldn't be destroyed. They need to be kept as an archive somewhere, because, you know, the information on them is invaluable. And, you know, there are, some of them are very pretty, so students could go and learn about different art forms from them. But, you know, you're engaging with the past, and whilst the past in these islands is a very difficult past, I'm not personally sure whether erasing that past is actually going to, as in the visual representation of that past, is going to erase that past. And it could very well be that the cathedral becomes a place to confront a past as opposed to other places. So on that, I would say I have a particular stance, and I would say I'm obviously clearly not very dispassionate at all about the fact that these plantation owners made their backs off enslaved labour. It's, you know, highly problematic. And I think there are issues in this country, obviously, around decolonising, and issues to do with statues to people who actually owned slaves. You don't get that in the Caribbean, or certainly not on St. Vincent and in Barbados, the two places I know well. But what you do get is the fact that, you know, this happened, that slavery happened. It's just part of that. The island is shaped by the slave trade, by engaging with the slave trade. Not necessarily so much St. Vincent, there was more slavery going on Barbados and Jamaica, but the names of the parishes, the fact that most of the people there are Christian. There's a few Rastafarian and some other sort of communities as well. But Christianity is still very strong. All of the things that I've been to have started with a Christian prayer, ended with a Christian prayer. So there's that sort of side to it. But yeah, I can't be dispassionate about the slave trade. You know, slavery was abolished in this country, and it was still going on in the Caribbean. You know, for over 20 years, people were still being bought and sold and owned. And, you know, that's just astonishing. And then when the plantation owners were compensated, they got money for that. The former enslaved people got nothing. And so I think, you know, that juxtaposition between what happened in this country and what happened in the islands, our colonies, is something that I don't think necessarily is made as aware perhaps as it should do.
Thank you, Tina. And I think a question linking into that is, when you've sort of looked at some of these memorials, have you been in touch with any of the descendants of these families? And do you know if people still come to visit any of these graves?
The graves in the graveyard, obviously the old ones, no. And the graves in the cathedral, or the memorials in the cathedral, not as far as I'm aware. It's really difficult. If you live in the Caribbean is, so I'm being quite general here, but there's quite a lot of suspicion of graveyards. So people will come to churches for rituals, you know, for services, but going around looking at memorials is considered odd. It's sort of connected to the dark side and ghosts, and you know, it's not something that people routinely would do. So you are seen as a bit of an oddity if you turn up and start looking at graves and looking at memorials. It is something that is purely the preserve of largely Western academics, to be quite honest. So yeah, it's a bit odd, but there are descendants of some of the plantation owners still on the island, but most of them have sort of married locally, and so it's sort of like in their dim, dark past. It's really difficult. Is that something that people want to confront? The fact that maybe your ancestor 215 years ago was a slaver. I mean, it's not easy to engage with that. And then why would you go and visit the memorial of somebody who wasn't a particularly nice person in many ways?
Thanks for that answer, Tina. And is it known how children and other people died when it isn't engraved on their headstones?
No, it isn't, not at all. And the records, so in the Caribbean, obviously there are records, but a lot of them are termite eaten and in really bad condition simply because of the climate. But the very early, it's just the same as here, the early records that you get might list the name and that's about all. Sometimes they might list a relationship with somebody. So I don't know, George, say, son of so-and-so. But a lot of them are things like shipwrecked man or child found. I mean, there's an awful lot of people who they're buried, but you don't, all you know is that they are a man or a woman or a sailor or a soldier, but you don't even know the name of that person. And even as things sort of progress, you don't really get the ages that people died, and certainly not what they died of. I mean, that is all to do with the history of the registration service in this country and health, as to noting who died, who the relative was, and what they died of. So it's actually a very specific context that we have that information. A lot of countries still don't.
And do you have a favourite memorial on St. Vincent? And is there a particular reason why it's your favourite?
I quite like the one of Leybourne, simply because I like the name, and there's no other reason. I just think that's quite amusing. The one of Charles Brisbane inside the cathedral is stunning. I mean, it's absolutely a beautiful work of art. I wouldn't necessarily say it's my favourite though, and although it's really sad, the one to Janet Morin, clearly her parents saved up a huge amount of money to have the most impressive memorial you can imagine for the loss of their beloved daughter. And that touches me every time. But, reading through the text, when you read, loss after loss after loss, all of that's quite touching. But yeah, I mean, my favourite person that's buried is actually the superintendent of the Botanical Gardens, Dr. Alexander Anderson. But we don't know where he's buried, but I do know that he's buried there somewhere. So I'm doing some work on the Botanical Garden at the moment. So he's my current favourite.
Thanks, Tina. We look forward to hearing how that research goes into that. I suppose the final question that's quite poignant to finish on is that we've looked at, obviously today, some of the memorials that you've talked about, and particularly about the slave owners. In terms of actually the funeral service itself, would there be many people there? Was it expected that slaves were meant to attend these funerals, or was it very much a segregated kind of event, a funeral for an owner of a slave?
Do you know, we don't have any records about that on St. Vincent, but certainly the family would go, and it was a social thing. So to bury somebody and to have a memorial is something that would have been a social status. And one of the things that I'm really fascinated about and trying to do some work about, don't forget, if somebody died, so a letter then had to go to Britain or to London or wherever the stone was being made to say X person has died. This is what we want for the memorial. The memorial would then have to be made and then shipped back. So you can imagine, it probably would have taken a couple of weeks for the letter to get there. Then the memorial would have to be made and then shipped back. So you're probably talking about 6 months to get a memorial stone made. And think of the expense. To transport a piece of stone back from England to the Caribbean, there weren't many ships that went direct to St. Vincent. It might have gone to Jamaica or more likely Barbados, and then transferred onto a schooner that was then taken to the island. So, what is a small memorial here might be the equivalent of a very big memorial back home. So I've got no doubt that when somebody was buried, there would have been a service and a stone laying service as well. In terms of whether the enslaved Africans would have gone, probably not, because it means that they're not working. And it depends on the plantation owner, who that plantation owner was. But, you know, as with all of the plantations, some owners were less nasty than others, but they all wanted their pound of flesh. Literally, they all wanted to get as much money out of their property as they could. So to give somebody time off to just attend a funeral, I can't imagine that happened very often at all.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you, everyone, for your your questions today. Sorry, I've got a little bit of dog trouble today. Everyone, so thank you so much for your questions. Thank you so much to Tina for her time today. Everyone, as I said, do have a look on our website for upcoming lectures. I'm about to put the October ones on very shortly. But if you've got any ideas for future lunchtime lectures that you'd like us to do, please do let us know. Thank you to those who emailed me last week. I'm in the process of getting back to you, because some of those suggestions sent last week, you'll be pleased to know we've got people lined up for you. But if you'd like to email me with your feedback or any ideas or suggestions for future talks, you can email me at digital@thecct.org.uk. Now, just to final reminder, if you'd like to look at the ride and stride route that I'm cycling with Shana James in just over 2 weeks. So we're doing 39 miles in one day, visiting 21 churches across Suffolk. You can look at the route on our Just Giving page, and we'll post a link to that very shortly, so you can have a look at the route. But if anyone's got any questions, please can comment away. But thank you for joining us. Thank you again to Tina, and I look forward, everyone, to seeing you at a future lunchtime lecture. Take care and have a great week, everyone.